The Shaftesbury Society, this weekly meeting from the John Locke Foundation. My name is Mitch Kokai, and glad to welcome you in once again for another very interesting conversation. I'm going to talk to you in just a couple of moments about the panelists that we have for a very important conversation that deals with an issue before the U.S. Supreme Court. But first, a couple of notes. We want to thank you, first of all, if you participated during this past weekend's Carolina Liberty Conference. It was great to see several hundred people who were interested in freedom and liberty gathered together in Raleigh, talking about some issues, policies. We had, of course, the U.S. Senate debate that took place on Saturday. And so for everyone who took part, we were happy to have you. Thanks for doing that. If you didn't have a chance to attend, and we know that there were several dozen people who wanted to come but couldn't because we had to cut the attendance off. If you would like to see some videos from the event, the Senate debate is on the website of the Carolina Journal, carolinajournal.com. You can also see Carolina Journal's coverage of the Senate debate right now, one of the top stories on the site, carolinajournal.com. And you will be seeing some video interviews posted in the days to come at carolinajournal.com. So you'll get quite a bit of activity from the Carolina Liberty Conference, even if you weren't there. So thanks once again for participating. Also, we're going to be talking about a Supreme Court case involving North Carolina today, but I also want to mention something else, and you can find coverage of this at carolinajournal.com. On Friday, late in the afternoon, because that's when these things tend to happen, is late in the afternoon on Fridays, leaders of the General Assembly announced that they were going to the U.S. Supreme Court to try to get a ruling that would favor them in the case of the disputed congressional map. We know that we've been dealing with redistricting. A three-judge panel in the state courts had decided that maps drawn by the General Assembly for the North Carolina House and North Carolina Senate could be used for the elections coming up in this fall. But the three-judge panel threw out the congressional map and drew a new map that most observers are considering to be a 14-seat delegation to the House that would split evenly between Republicans and Democrats, perhaps a 7 Republican, 6 Democrat, 1 swing seat result coming out of that. The General Assembly appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying the courts should not have done what they did in throwing out the General Assembly's maps. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who is the one who hears appeals and considers appeals from the Fourth Circuit, where North Carolina is located, he's asked the other parties in this case to have their responses to him by 5 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. So we should see some sort of response from the Supreme Court no earlier than the end of the day Wednesday, and more likely sometime after that. Stay tuned to carolinajournal.com. We'll have the latest. You can go to the website now and find the story about the appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court that was issued on Friday. Well, that brings us now to today's topic, which also deals with the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court announced in January that it would consider a pair of cases dealing with the role of race in college admissions. In both cases, brought by the same group, the High Court is asked to overrule a decision made almost 20 years ago. One of those cases involves admissions at Harvard, the other admissions at a school right here in North Carolina, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Joining us to discuss the cases and their importance for students and prospective students in North Carolina and across the country are two experts. Kenny Xu is president of the group Color Us United. He's also author of the book An Inconvenient Minority, and that book focuses on the admissions issues that led to the suit against Harvard. Also joining us is Jenna Robinson. She is president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center focuses on higher education issues, both in North Carolina and across the country. Welcome to both of you.
It's good to be here, Mitch.
Thank you for having me.
Kenny, I'm going to start with you because your book, An Inconvenient Minority, was really based on this issue that that led to this lawsuit against Harvard specifically. Tell us how you came to write a book about this issue and what an inconvenient minority tells us.
Thanks so much, Mitch. So I went to Davidson College here in North Carolina. I know that this is a state famous for its higher education. There's no doubt about it. In fact, I met a judge the other day who went to Duke Law School, who married somebody from Chapel Hill, and he opened his opening prayer by bashing Chapel Hill. So I know that this is higher education. North Carolinians take a lot of pride in higher education, and not just because of the basketball teams, but because we know that great higher education institutions aren't built in a day. They represent the excellence that North Carolina has to offer to the rest of not just the country, but the world. These are centers of excellence. That's what elite colleges are supposed to be about. They're supposed to be about excellence. This does not mean that we shouldn't prioritize the disadvantaged or enact proposals for, say, equity in other arenas, like, for example, maybe some would argue welfare, others would argue in the criminal justice system. But one thing is for certain, you cannot try to turn an excellence center, a center that was built for the purpose of encouraging the highest achievement in the state and the country. You cannot turn such a center into a center trying to focus on the disadvantaged. And this is the center at the heart of the controversy that surrounds the Harvard admissions case, the UNC admissions case that has recently been taken up by the Supreme Court, and is also the subject of my book, An Inconvenient Minority. The subtitle of my book, An Inconvenient Minority, I think says more about what I'm about to talk about here, which is the attack on Asian American excellence and the fight for meritocracy. And I don't say Asian American excellence because I believe that only Asian Americans should be given access to these centers of excellence. But I say Asian American excellence because I think that Asian Americans in this country represent a certain principle that we are in danger of losing as a country, especially in the context of this Harvard case. Let's go over the facts of this Harvard case that is now being litigated in the entire court of the land, the US Supreme Court. According to the case, Asian Americans have to score 440 points higher on the SAT to have the same chance of admission as a Black person, and 150 points higher on the SAT to have the same chance of admission as a white person. How does Harvard justify this? Harvard knows this, and they rate Asian Americans highest on academics, highest on extracurriculars. But in order to compensate, and in order to somehow find a way to force Asian Americans lower on the admissions scale than would otherwise be suggested by their academic merit, they score Asians lowest on this personality score, which is an invented score that they make up to judge Asian Americans on matters of so-called character, on matters of likability, on humor, on leadership, which they rate Asians conveniently below whites, below Hispanics, and below Blacks. And there's no objective evidence to corroborate this either, because actually Asians score highest on teacher recommendations. They score highest on alumni recommendations. They score second highest on counselor recommendations. These are suggestions that Asians probably do bring something to the table from a personality perspective, yet they're conveniently ignored in this Harvard case. Why? Because Harvard is, and UNC Chapel Hill also, is so bent on the concept of equity, on the concept that they need proportional representation at their universities. Let me tell you this, if you follow just the excellence principle at Harvard, Asians would make up approximately 50% of the university. Where do I get this number? I'll tell you where I get this number. Because Asians make up 50% of the SAT scores above 1,500 in America today. That's why. They make up the highest percentage, a significantly higher percentage of the top grades in this country. They make up this most significant highest percentage in the SAT scores in this country. And so for matters of academic excellence, they should be considered in that way. But instead, Asians make up about 19% of Harvard University. So this is the subject of my book, which is this tension here between this excellence principle that these universities should be aspiring to, admitting for, and this equity movement that is trying to make everything about race and trying to ensure that all of the races are equally balanced in society. That's why I wrote my book, An Inconvenient Minority.
So a group called Students for Fair Admissions ended up suing Harvard. It's lost at the district court level and also lost at the Court of Appeals. The same group sued UNC Chapel Hill, lost at the initial trial court level, but then the Supreme Court decided to group the two cases together, basically bypassing appellate review in the UNC case and grouping them together for a hearing likely this fall at the U.S. Supreme Court to deal with this issue. I want to bring in Jenna Robinson now. And Jenna, you've been following the UNC case in particular. Were you surprised when you saw that the justices decided to, rather than allowing this case to go through the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, decided, no, let's go ahead and take this up now along with this Harvard case and address this issue?
I think that there are good reasons to combine the cases, and that is because both of them have one piece in common, and that is the institutions that take federal money, according to Title VI, cannot discriminate against the people that they serve. And so both UNC and Harvard, despite the fact that Harvard is private and UNC is public, both of them are subject to Title VI, which means they cannot discriminate. And so that is the part of the law that both court cases has in common. And for that reason, I think it does make sense to combine them. Now, of course, since UNC is public, there's also the 14th Amendment to contend with. So there is, I think, UNC's case is a little bit different than Harvard's, but if they really want to look at whether the universities are discriminating on the basis of race, then they can treat both of the cases the same and take them at the same time. And I think if they do take both of those cases at the same time and rule obviously in the same way, then I think it sets a better precedent going forward to guide the behaviors of other universities if the court has kind of set something out as a standard for both public and private schools at the same time.
We're going to get to another set of questions on this, but first of all, I want to remind folks who are watching us on Facebook that if you have questions about these cases and you'd like our experts to respond to them, feel free to leave a comment on the John Locke Foundation's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/John Locke Foundation, which is one of the places where we're showing this. I will be monitoring the comments to see your questions, and we'll pass them along to our two experts to get their insights on the responses to your questions. One of the things, and I'd like to get both of your comments about this, one of the things that interests me about this case is that the Supreme Court often addresses something that's new or a new application of something that has been on the books for a while. In both of these cases, Students for Fair Admissions, that group is asking the Supreme Court to basically reverse something it's already done. It's not really a new issue. It's saying, hey, you got it wrong almost 20 years ago. Let's do something different about that now. I'd like to get both of your responses to this. Do you think this is a winning argument that, hey, you got it wrong in 2003 with the Michigan case, now's a chance to get it right?
I think that there has always been an understanding, going back even before the Michigan case, that racial preferences in higher education should be something with a deadline, that it is not something that we should be doing for all of eternity. That is the position that the court took I can't even remember the year now, but going far past a long time ago, saying that we don't want to have to continue making up for past injustices forever. Affirmative action was put in place and racial preferences were put in place because of past discrimination. But the understanding was always that this would be time limited. And so I think it does make sense almost 20 years after the most recent court take on racial preferences in higher education that it's time to bring it back up again. I think, especially in light of the very egregious way that Harvard is treating Asian American students. I think it's gone far beyond just doing a holistic admission, which is, of course, what all the universities say. They say, well, our admissions process is holistic. We're looking at a whole slew of different characteristics when we're admitting students. But Harvard is putting their thumb on the scale in, I think, a pretty, as I said, pretty egregious way, especially against Asian Americans. And it's time to address those behaviors.
Kenny, how about you? You have been following this issue very closely. The Students for Fair Admissions group is not saying, well, this is a slightly different application of your old precedent. They're basically saying your old precedent was wrong, you should reverse it. What do you think about that strategy?
Yeah, so I guess I want to trace the history, and thank you, Jen. I agree with you in terms of this. In terms of, yes, I think that they should reverse this old precedent, but I wanted to expand upon why this precedent was set in the first place. So in 1979, court made an affirmative action decision called Regents of California versus Bakke. In this decision, 4 of the justices said they did not want Harvard. This was a 9-justice court, still 9-justice court. 4 of the justices said, no, it's not appropriate for University of California to have racial quotas in their medical school, which was what they were doing before. 4 of the justices said it was appropriate for racial quotas to be implemented in the medical school. And the presiding judge, the presiding justice that made the swing decision was Powell, Justice Powell, who made a decision that said, we will not, he tried to split the baby. He said, we will not permit racial quotas in the University of California Medical School, but we will permit the use of race in the admissions process as a plus factor, is what he said. Why? This was the first time a justice had ever uttered these words, but he said, because of the maintenance of student body diversity, it's permitted to use race in college admissions because of the maintenance of student body diversity. Diversity. This was the first example ever used of the diversity justification that allowed for explicit racial preferences. Now you may wonder, well, what's the difference between having racial preferences as a plus factor and an explicit racial quota? And the answer is there's no difference. The difference is purely aesthetic, semantic. It actually allows colleges like Harvard to get away with more discrimination. Because at least when you make an explicit racial quota saying, okay, well, we need 15% blacks, then everybody knows, okay, you're going to have 15% blacks. But instead, Harvard says, still goes by this very opaque admissions process that conveniently pushes Asians to between 15 and 20% of the university for the past 25 years. But they will never say it's an explicit racial quota because explicit racial quotas are banned under Bakke. But race is a plus factor. It's the same thing, guys. It's the same thing. That is the ruse that Students for Fair Admissions is trying to expose. And I think they will be successful at exposing that.
You mentioned the Bakke case from the late 70s, and then the last major ruling in this issue was the one that came out in 2003 out of Michigan, the Grutter versus Bolliger case.
Mhm.
And in that one, if I remember correctly, and I think this is what Jenna was alluding to, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, I believe, wrote the majority opinion and basically said, we're going to uphold this, but this is something that we should not, that should not be continuing, say, 25 years from now. And that ruling came out in 2003. Well, now, by the time the Supreme Court rules in this case, it will have been 20 years since O'Connor said this shouldn't last for more than 25 more years. So perhaps now the time is ripe for the Supreme Court to say, you know, even if we were right years ago, now is a time to change gears, or even more forcefully or dramatically, we got it wrong, and now's the time to correct the wrong. You think that may be what's likely to come about this time?
Well, I have a more radical opinion. I don't think the court should have ever done racial preferences. And I get it. I get why they did. I think everybody here in this conversation gets it. Blacks were historically oppressed in this country, and people feel a need to uplift them. I get it. But there are other better ways of doing it. And in fact, the use of racial preferences historically has hamstrung Black success in so many areas, such as the maths and sciences. Did you know that the percentage of Black Americans who drop out of math and science majors at elite universities is, in some cases, 2 or 3 times higher than other races in the maths and sciences? Why? Because they're put into classes in which they face much stiffer competition, in which they are likely to graduate at the bottom of their class. Are there exceptions? They absolutely are. But the use of racial preferences, especially in the top math and science disciplines, the ones that will get you high salaries, the ones that will get you stability, tend to be very discouraging for Black Americans. They're a very discouraging environment. Furthermore, that problem could be solved if Black Americans were put into the programs in which they were competitively qualified for. This is why HBCUs have higher productions of math PhDs among Black Americans than these so-called predominantly white universities. I don't think racial preferences has done much for Black success. I think there's a good case to argue that it's hurt it.
In fact, Kenny, folks who I've spoken with about this issue have said that the evidence of what you're talking about, the negative impact of the mismatch between the students' credentials going in, their academic achievement, and their preparation for these high-level classes, that mismatch, the evidence of the negative impact of that mismatch is much more profound now than it was 20 years ago, certainly 40, 45 years ago. That could weigh into the Supreme Court's decision, couldn't it?
It absolutely could. And I think that, Kenny's right on. There is very strong evidence that there's mismatch. And it's not just Black Americans. It's any student who is admitted under standards that are different than the rest of the school. So legacy students don't do as well. Athletes, we know, who are admitted under different standards don't do as well academically. Students who are admitted because of geographic diversity considerations don't do as well. Any student who is admitted to a university without the qualifying entrance exams or entrance scores that match that university don't do as well as the average student or the student that had to compete to get in. And I think that's very strong evidence that we're doing something wrong. We are doing students a disservice when we let them into universities for which they're not ready to compete.
Jenna, I want to stick with you for just a few moments here because the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal focuses on higher education issues that are important across the country, but you have a special focus being based here in North Carolina on the North Carolina schools. What sort of reaction have you heard among the folks who you consult with and talk to about this UNC case getting to the Supreme Court? I mean, even though it may make sense to lump it together with the Harvard case, it is kind of odd that it moved forward this quickly and didn't have to go through the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. What are people saying about that?
I think that people who are, people who are defending UNC itself is concerned that this is going to the Supreme Court. They don't want to lose the case. They've spent a lot of money defending the case. They've crafted their policy very carefully, keeping the precedent from 2003 in mind. They don't want to lose this case. And I think it being expedited has them concerned that they will lose this case. They will have to change their policies. And that's not what they want to happen.
One of the things that we have seen is, I mentioned a couple of times that the latest major ruling on this case came out in 2003, but there was a case 5 or 6 years ago out of the University of Texas in which basically the Supreme Court upheld what it had upheld back in 2003 in the Michigan case. But our U.S. Supreme Court has changed quite a bit since then. Anthony Kennedy wrote that decision several years ago. He's gone. There have been other changes. We have a much different makeup of the court. Do either of you have any thoughts about how this current makeup of the court, which some have described as a 6 conservative block, a 6 conservative justice block, or maybe a 5 conservative justice plus John Roberts block, how they might respond differently than the court did just 5 or 6 years ago?
I think that the fact that the court has decided to hear this case is indicative that they want to make a change. Now, how far they will go in making that change is anyone's guess. As Kenny said, the court has in the past kind of tried to have it both ways on racial preferences. They're trying to thread the needle, and they may try to do that again. They may try to come up with some kind of halfway measure where some use of race is still permitted under certain circumstances, but I don't know what they will decide on that and whether they will explicitly ban racial preferences or not. But I do think the fact that they decided to take these two cases, decided to take them together, which was in effect expediting the UNC case, I do think that that's indicative that they will not uphold the 2003 precedent. And I'm usually pretty hesitant to make predictions, but I think that if the court wanted the 2003 precedent to stand, they didn't have to take these cases at all.
Kenny, do you agree with that? Does this does the fact that the cases are going to the Supreme Court, including a case that hasn't even gone through an appeals court, is that a signal that the court wants to do something?
I think they are going to make a change. My fear is that for the sake of compromise, they will water down the change, or they will consider Harvard and UNC more narrowly. It's not what I want them to do. I want them to commit with the full force of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to say that institutions should not discriminate on the basis of race that take federal funding, which both colleges do. So I'm afraid, for the sake of compromise, that or maybe because John Roberts wants to make a sort of united front justice bench, that he will seek a more watered down ruling instead of the ruling that a case such as this deserves. Remember, the whole presence of affirmative action of race preferences in higher education was decided by one vote, back in '79. So, but if I were a betting man, I would say this would be a 7-2 decision with Kagan joining with the conservatives. But we might not get the decision that I really, really want to happen.
I'm going to have another question. Oh, go ahead, Jenna.
In here for just 1 second and make a distinction between affirmative action and racial preferences.
Sure. Yeah.
And so racial preferences are explicit preferences in the admissions process based on a person's race. So whether it's holistic or quotas, it means that you are treating someone differently during the admissions process. And that is the part that is going to court, racial preferences. Affirmative action, on the other hand, goes back further. It goes back to the 60s. And affirmative action is the idea is that you try to recruit people, you try to encourage people to apply for the job, and then you do not discriminate against them in the application process. So affirmative action is something that even if racial preferences are banned, even if we get the outcome that would be a very clear-cut outcome, outlawing racial preferences, universities would still be able to recruit qualified students who are minorities or who have historically been discriminated against. So they can still go to universities, go to high schools where students are, unlikely to go to college and say, look, if you're qualified, we want you. We actively want you to come to Harvard or UNC. We want you to apply. But then once they have gotten to the application process, they'll be treated like everyone else. So I did want to make that one distinction.
Sure. And here's my fear with even the term affirmative action. It's that if the court makes a ruling that says, colleges should not consider explicit quotas based on race or even like racial preferences, but says, colleges can like recruit from underrepresented minority groups or things like that, as long as they meet the qualifications, but they make a sort of watered down ruling. Harvard has shown in the past the ability, and they're already building an infrastructure for this right now, to evade such a ruling. They have already made SATs optional for admission, which is the primary accountability factor for schools like Harvard to prove discrimination. Once Harvard, and this is a short step away from Harvard completely eliminating SATs from admissions. Once they do, there will be no accountability mechanism to say, actually, you did choose a less qualified candidate over a more qualified candidate. And so for me, I want to make sure that the spirit of the ruling is maintained, which is why I think we need a explicit ruling.
More questions for both Jenna and Kenny in just a bit, but I want to remind you as well, if you are watching this presentation on the John Locke Foundation's Facebook page, feel free to submit your own questions or comments for the experts. We'll be happy to pass them along. The web address is facebook.com/John Locke Foundation. And we always love to get your questions that we can pass along to the experts who join us for the Shaftesbury Society. Kenny, I want to turn back to you because we've talked a little bit about the impact of these preferences on African-American students. The fact that if there's this mismatch, it leads to lower graduation rates, higher dropout rates, just less success in general for these students. There's also an impact on the Asian American students. Not only is there less of a likelihood that they'll get in at a particular school, but it also changes some of their behavior, doesn't it? Changes the way that they go about their academic career in trying to get into one of these schools.
So I want to talk about the impact on one, Asian Americans, and two, on the rest of society, which everybody should care about no matter what race they are. Number one, the impact on Asian Americans. It instills a performance anxiety culture among Asian Americans. 100%, no doubt about it. Why? Because Asians know now that elite universities are judging them in relation to other Asian Americans. They're put in their own separate pool and they're being judged in relation to other Asian Americans. Therefore, it creates a culture of self-hatred and suspicion against other Asian Americans, between Asians. It's horrible. It's truly horrible what this has done to Asian Americans in this country, this policy. And you might say, oh, well, people shouldn't care about elite college admissions. They're just a few spots. Yeah, but guess what? The reality is people do care about elite college admissions. And by the way, not just Asians, people of every race. I know, your Whole Foods mom, the average Whole Foods mom of whatever race probably cares more about, what college their son or daughter gets into than she cares about, Ukraine or Russia, that's for sure. So guess what? As long as this continues to be an issue of importance, it's important that we do it right. And it's important that we do it in a way that does not marginalize populations, creates high performance anxiety, and gives people a fair and equal shot, not with equal outcomes, but allows people to say, hey, you perform well on the test, you study hard, Asian Americans study twice as many hours as the average American. They deserve those spots. They should get them. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the impact on the rest of American society and why you should care. Not lastly, but I do want to talk about the impact because I did read this important Martin Center article from Shannon Watkins, who talked about North Carolina creating a new math pathways program for the sake of equity. So what is it in this new math pathways program? Well, basically what happens is in response to the fact that North Carolina is now not getting the most qualified math students, now they are trying to water down their curriculum so that the lower performing students can so-called succeed. So they're advocating for new math programs in that are not so computationally focused. Which is in effect a lowering of the math standard for the sake of equity. You guys understand that as more universities are recruiting less competitive people, they are incentivized because they don't want low graduation rates, they don't want high dropout rates, to lower the curriculum standards in relation. This is an attack on excellence. This is not just an attack on any racial group. This has consequences for innovation, for infrastructure, for America's future. So that's why I am so passionate about this issue, not just for the sake of Asian Americans, but for the sake of everyone.
So basically what you're saying, Kenny, if I'm encapsulating this correctly, is that the effort to bring in students who might not have the same qualifications as your current student body ends up lowering the standards for everyone, and so everyone gets a less valuable education than they otherwise would.
Sure, and I'll let Jenna speak more to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, Kenny's absolutely right, and I think that we're seeing it nationwide. The standards that used to be commonplace across American college curricula are being changed. I think we all know that classics departments have been gutted. They've been taking out requirements for Greek and Latin, which are historically very hard, a kind of a hard bar to pass. Math curriculum have come under attack. There's much more of an emphasis on getting a student through, regardless of what that student learns, than making sure they get a rigorous education in the process. And I think part of that is because universities do not want to encounter the fact and address the fact that they are letting students in without the necessary qualifications for success.
Jenna, Kenny referenced an article at the Martin Center from your colleague Shannon Watkins. Is this a one-off, or are we seeing this sort of thing in various parts of the curriculum and in various campuses?
So this particular article about the math pathways was looking specifically at UNC Chapel Hill, but we have seen many curriculum changes over the past 20 years. And the quantitative aspect of curriculum, I think, has been changed significantly in that time. Not all the schools are doing this explicit kind of math pathways, but it is a problem across the system and across the country that our courses are being changed and watered down.
Have you seen, before we move on to a slightly different topic, but something that's related to this, have you seen any response from leadership either at UNC Chapel Hill or the UNC system to the suit? Have there been any changes that you've seen that the suit from Students for Fair Admissions has brought about?
No, I think UNC and the system are wanting to keep everything status quo until after the case has been decided.
I have seen a change. They've increased their legal budget.
Yeah.
Well, and going to the Supreme Court will certainly cost a lot of money for everyone concerned. I want to bring in something else that's on this topic, but not directly related to the cases, but it's just in interesting timing. This morning, I read this headline at the Issues and Insights website. It has the INI-TIPP poll, which is the poll they do. Americans want merit, not woke politics, to decide college admissions. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, oh, we've got to talk about this in our discussion today. So let me read you the first couple of graphs from this story, which is at Issues and Insights, or issuesinsights.com, the Issues and Insights publication. America's colleges and universities increasingly use non-academic criteria, including gender, family income, and race, to decide who gets admitted and who doesn't. It's a trend most Americans seem to deeply dislike, the latest INI-TIPP poll shows. Parents want their kids to face a merit-based admissions policy over one that is, for the lack of a better word, woke. And we'll go through some of the details of this in just a bit, but before we get into those details, I'd like to hear from both of you. Are you surprised, or does this fit in with what you're hearing from parents and other people concerned about this, that they want this issue of admissions to be decided by merit, not by some sort of political calculation?
I don't think that's surprising at all. California, which I think is probably our wokest state, most woke state, I'm not sure the terminology there, but in California, as you know, there has been for a long time a law against having racial preferences in admissions. And people said, we want merit to be what decides university admissions. Recently, there was a push to try to overturn that law so that universities could use other factors for admissions into universities. And California, one of our most left-leaning states, said no. California voters want merit to decide university admissions. And they said so pretty clearly in that vote. And so if California voters are making it clear that they want merit to be what decides university admissions, I don't think it should be surprising at all that a poll, across the country is showing the same thing.
Kenny, I'm guessing you're not surprised either.
Well, if you allow me to plug myself just a little bit, before I became president of Colorist United, which advocates for a race-blind America, I was actually recruited based on my work with the No on Proposition 16 campaign in California, where I was the director for media outreach. By the way, our campaign raised $2 million. And the other campaign, the Yes on Proposition 16 campaign that wanted racial preferences in college admissions, raised $28 million. So we were outspent 14-1, and we still won. So yeah, this is an unpopular issue. A new Pew Research poll said 75% of Americans want merit-only college admissions, is what they said, including majorities of Asians, whites, and Hispanics. I think blacks were like 50-50 or so. But even so, that's about as close to a consensus as you're ever going to get in America on a hot button political issue. This is another reason why I think this is a winning issue against wokeness.
I'm going to get into the details now of the story that went along with this headline of Americans want merit, not woke politics, to decide college admissions. So the poll asked a simple question: to what extent do you support or oppose colleges and universities using the following factors to make admission decisions? And then they threw out a range of ideas: race or ethnicity, gender, whether a parent went to the school, high school grades, extracurricular activities, athletic ability, household income. The applicant is the child of a famous person, which I'm sure is a result of that scandal that we saw recently, and SAT, ACT scores. So the possible answers included support strongly, support somewhat, oppose strongly, and not sure. Only 3 categories got 50% or higher support among all Americans. High school grades, the highest. 76% supported using high school grades. 67% supported using SAT and ACT scores. And 50%, about 50-50, said extracurricular activities. All of those other categories were below 50%. Athletic ability was 40%, household income 30%, race or ethnicity 26%, gender 23%, whether or not the parent went to the school, so the legacy admissions 21%, and dead last, not surprising probably to any of us, that the applicant is the child of a famous person. Actually, 17% of people thought
I'll
that
put that a
that
little
should be a
higher. I'm just
factor.
kidding. Go ahead.
But anyway, so I found that very interesting that that poll came out today. And we could, if we have a chance in the last few minutes, we may dig into even more of the details that were quite interesting. But I'm guessing that the work that you've done, both of you on this, you were not surprised to see that grades and standardized test scores are the things that parents think should be used.
Absolutely. I think it's part of the American dream that you work hard and you are judged on a combination of, your talents, your grit, and it's what you bring to the table through hard work and perseverance and applying the gifts that you have in the way that make the most sense. And I think most Americans agree on that. They want to see merit. And I think, we can squabble about, how much should the SAT be weighted compared to grades, compared to extracurriculars, but some matrix of, talent and hard work, those are what contribute to excellence. And those are what Americans agree should be used for college admissions. And I think this is one time where, maybe more politicians should be putting their finger in the wind and saying, this is what Americans want. Let's do this. Why do we have to take this to the Supreme Court? It is common sense. And a long time ago, racial preferences should have been taken out of college admissions, any kind of preferences.
Yeah, and I like what Jenna said about having a matrix of talent and hard work, which is the basis for what I'm about to say. Some people argue against the use of standardized tests for various reasons. They think that standardized tests don't accurately capture a student's potential or anything, or some people say the SATs are racist. I'm just going to dismiss that out of hand. There's no way that a standardized test in which you're testing for math and English skills could be racist, and that is given to everybody in pretty much the exact same form. But I'm going to contend with this objection about standardized tests right now, which is that it's not totally accurate of a person. Of course, it's not totally accurate of a person, but it does do two things really, really well. One, it's objective. This is a standardized test is pretty much the only place where a poor person could stand up on the same shoulder as a rich person and say, I beat you, like fair and square. A poor person going to a really bad school, an A at a really bad school is worth a lot different than an A at a really good school. And the rich person will always have the ability to say, well, I went to the better school, I got the A there, the curriculum was harder there, which is probably true. But in a standardized test, the rich person cannot say that. If the poor person beat the rich person, the poor person wins. It's objective, it's actually equitable. And then the other thing is that you need to understand why standardized tests were created. They were created to eliminate discrimination. They're created because standardized tests measure for two things. One is intelligence, innate intelligence, right? If a person is innately more intelligent, they're more likely to complete the work that a college level is assigned to them. And then two, it measures hard work, right? If a person is not so innately intelligent, but studied many hours a day to do well on this test, they should also be rewarded for that, because that proxies a number of different qualities. And standardized tests measure both of them. And so both of those things are meritorious from the aspect of performance on colleges. So I do think we do need to continue focus on standardized tests as a significant aspect of college admissions.
Couple of more interesting points from the story, and I've linked to the actual story from Issues and Insights on the Facebook comments. So if you are interested in following up on that, you can click that link and read more. But here are a couple of others. You might expect that the people who would support these preferences the most would be the ones who supposedly benefit from them. But this poll also found, I'll throw first to the gender piece, fewer women than men supported using gender as part of the admissions process, 21% of women compared to 26% of men. African Americans mostly support the meritocratic view that grades, test scores, and extracurricular activities should be what matters. 74% of them saying grades, 59% test scores, 56% extracurriculars. They also came close to 50% with athletics, 49% support. And the article says perhaps that's because that's been a traditional and highly successful avenue for disadvantaged minority youths to gain college admissions. But also, African Americans are marginally more likely to support race as an admission criterion when compared to whites, but it's still not a majority. Only 43% of African Americans supported race as an admissions criterion, 45% opposed it. So it's kind of a 50-50 deal for folks who are African American about whether they think race should be used at all. I'm guessing that ought to factor into the Supreme Court's decision too. If the people who are supposedly benefiting from this don't really want it or don't think it should be used, you would think that would sway justices one way or the other.
And I think that's because many African Americans have seen the consequences of using race in admissions, even for their purported benefit. They go back and tell stories, guys. People aren't unintelligent about these issues. They understand that people who make policies that are trying to help them don't always understand them or even have the best intentions at heart. And if the objective is to oftentimes decisions made for racial preferences are made for the benefit of the decision maker, not for the benefit of the so-called underrepresented population. Because Harvard sees ethnic diversity as critical to its aesthetics, critical to its fundraising, critical to its ability to appeal to progressive elites, and also critical to its own sort of self-professed ideals of making like a diversity utopia. But in order to make a diversity utopia, just like that famous story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, the famous philosophy story about creating a utopia under the back of a single child. You create that diversity utopia under the back of some very, very frustrating and dispiriting things against African Americans and Asian Americans.
Our time is running short, but I want to ask both of you this question, and this is, we've mentioned the fact that 2003 was the last major decision from the U.S. Supreme Court on race preferences in college admissions, and at that time the court said, we're going to continue to say that this is okay, but we all know that this is something that needs to be phased out, and Sandra Day O'Connor, if I'm remembering it correctly, said sometime probably within 25 years, these need to be gone. By the time the court rules on this case, it will have been about 20 years since that ruling. I want to hear from both of you, just how important is it that the Supreme Court goes ahead and makes a decision to get rid of these race preferences once and for all? If they don't do it, what's the harm of them not taking that kind of sweeping action? Either one of you could start.
Well, I think that one, it'll dissuade future plaintiffs. And so if we don't do it now, plaintiffs will probably wait until there are more changes on the court. And in the meantime, when we don't have, as long as we don't have a decision, as long as we're operating under the rules as they are now, more people will be hurt by the policies that we have in place. More students who are let in because of preferences will fail to graduate or will fail to take meaningful courses and will instead be shunted into soft options in the university. And so it will hurt their future success. And also, More students who should be let in because they do possess the qualifications for a university won't be given that opportunity, despite having worked really hard, despite having competed in a very difficult environment. And so I think that, all of the harms that we've mentioned, because these policies are in place, will continue. But I do think that if the court allows us to continue under status quo as we are now, we will see more states take action to overturn racial preferences. As you know, Mitch, there's a possibility of banning racial preferences in higher education and government jobs being on our ballot here in North Carolina. And if the court fails to act, I think that's what we'll see. We'll see more states taking action themselves.
Kenny, how about you? Final word on how important it is for the court to take a positive step on this issue this time around.
I agree with Jenna and everything that she said. I also want to focus on a couple of cultural consequences that maybe I'll leave you with. One, the industry of victimhood is increasing in America today. And this is victimhood based on your alleged racial oppression, based on your alleged sexual oppression, etc. And race preferences is based upon that industry. People need to understand that. There was a new study that came out just last year. Gen Z is the generation. 5% identified as LGBTQ in the 60s, 5% identified in the 70s, 5% in the 80s, 5%, like 6% in the 90s and 2000s. 20% identify that way in America right now from Generation Z. And that is much greater than the actual biology or the biological, what biologists have concluded represents the actual percentage of people who would identify that way under a biological record. The incentive to enact and to perform your own victimization and oppression for social status has greatly increased in this country today. And I see it every day in my generation. There are some fellowships right now that are offered, prestigious fellowships that are offered. And if you do not identify as a member of an oppressed category, you're not going to get it. And by the way, they mean Asian. They put Asian in the privileged category now. If you do not identify as BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous people of color, which excludes Asians naturally, you're not going to get these fellowships anymore. This is what's happening right now in our country. This is what's happening to me, my generation. We're diminishing excellence. We are we're moving from a culture where merit is the fundamental value, where it doesn't matter what gender or race or sexual orientation you are. You're just going to be judged based on what you can contribute. That has always been the American dream. We're moving to a country where your categories are going to have more of a significant effect on your outcomes in these situations. So in my book, An Inconvenient Minority, I explore these longer term consequences, not just what happens with Asians, what happens to our entire country when we diminish excellence. That is why I want the Supreme Court to make a stern ruling on this, the states to overturn race preferences and begin our ascent from where we have gotten ourselves into.
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court does have a chance to act on this issue. It is going to be hearing these cases from Students for Fair Admissions against both Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill at some time in the term that starts in October of 2022, probably likely early in that term, with a decision perhaps to come in 2023, which would be 20 years after the last major decision on race in college admissions, the Grutter case out of Michigan of 2003. Watching all of this action very closely will be both of the guests that you've been hearing from today. Kenny Xu is the leader of Color Us United. He is also the author of the book he just mentioned, An Inconvenient Minority. Jenna Robinson is the president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. Thanks so much for joining us.